crime, criminals, the mob. Jeffrey Sussman has written a lot about this. His new book is out now, though I recommend you all check out all of his books because they're all in this genre, is Mafia Hits, Misses, Wars, and Prosecutions, the Rise and Decline of the Mob in America. So please say hello to Jeffrey Sussman.
Hi, Diane. Nice to see you.
It is great to have you here. So you clearly have a fascination with the mob, the mafia. Where did this originate from?
There are a number of instances that occurred while I was growing up that made me very interested. The first occurred when I was 13. My father had a bar mitzvah for me, and a man handed me an envelope with a lot of money in it. It was a man I never saw before, and I never saw him again. Excuse me. And I asked my father who that was, and he said, that's an uncle of his, a man named Irving K. And he said that he had been, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. He said that Irving was his uncle by marriage. He married my father's mother's sister. And during Prohibition, he had been a bootlegger. And in 1935, he had been indicted but never tried for the murder of a gangster named Dutch Schultz. So that was the first thing that inspired my interest. The second thing was my father owned two garment factories, one in Queens, New York, and one in Brooklyn, New York. And on Saturday mornings, I used to work for him. He was open from 9 to 1 on Saturdays, and my job was fairly menial. It was usually sweeping the floor, collecting scraps of material that would be sent to a mill to be recycled. And one morning, I was given the assignment of carrying a bolt of cloth up from the basement to the cutter's table, where the cloth would be cut into pieces for dresses. And as I got to the top of the stairs, I heard my father and another man yelling fiercely at one another. And I saw that my father's fists were clenched. He looked like he was about to punch this man. And I was concerned because my father had been an amateur boxer when he was a teenager, and he was very quick with his fists when necessary. And he pointed his finger at this man and he said, "Get the hell out of here." And the man went like this, making a symbol of a gun, and went, "We're going to get you, son of a bitch," and walked out. So I didn't say anything to my father just then because he was so angry. I knew he didn't want to talk to me. But on the way home, I said to him, "Who was that and what was that about?" And he said that was a gangster named Johnny Dio who controlled trucking in the garment center and also a lot of illegal unions for garment workers. And he had tried to unionize my father's workers, and they voted against unionization. And Dio was very upset about that. He wanted my father to force his workers to vote to join a union, and they didn't want to because my father was a very progressive and generous boss, and he gave them all the benefits that they would have gotten, and they didn't have to pay extra for them, which they would have had to do if they had joined this illegal union. 2 weeks later, I graduated from the 8th grade, and my parents took me out for a celebratory dinner. And when we got home, we discovered that our house had been robbed. They had gone into the kitchen and turned over the refrigerator, and the entire contents of the refrigerator was poured and sprinkled and whatever all over the kitchen walls and counters. They had broken dishes and bowls and glasses. And it wasn't until sometime later that I learned that this was a message from the mob that you better go along with us or things are going to get even worse. My mother had a cousin. It's very interesting. He and his brother operated an Italian grocery store in an Italian neighborhood in Queens. And they took turns going to law school. So one would go one semester, the other would go the other semester. The one who wasn't in school would run the grocery store. They both learned to speak fluent Italian, and they got to know a lot of low-level people in the mafia through their store. And in 1956, one of the brothers was arrested for torching a warehouse in the Bronx. And his photograph was on the front page of a tabloid newspaper that doesn't exist anymore. called the Daily Mirror. And my father paid for his bail. They had been very good friends from the time they were in their late teens. And he went to my mother's cousin and he asked him if there was anything he could do. And he said, let me speak to some people and I'll see what I can work out for you. The deal that he worked out was that my father wouldn't have to unionize his workers, but he would have to hire their trucking company. And 2 years later, my father died of cancer. And his partner, who wasn't a tough guy, who wasn't the kind of guy who would stand up to mafia pressure, gave in to their demands. And they kept raising the trucking rates until they became so onerous that my father's partner turned over pieces of the business to them. And eventually they gained control of the business and they were buying raw merchandise for dresses and blouses and other apparel, but they weren't paying for them. They were buying it all on credit. And when they couldn't get credit anymore, they burnt down the factory for the insurance money. So that was the second thing that enticed my imagination about organized crime. Another thing was my mother had a cousin who became a very famous dress designer in the 1960s. He designed a dress for Jackie Kennedy as soon as she became First Lady. And she wore the dress on the cover of Look magazine, which was like Life magazine at the time. And it made him a very famous, very successful dress designer overnight. In the 1970s, when I had my own marketing and PR company, I had a client who was in the fitness business, and I thought it would be good for her and perhaps good for my mother's cousin if he could produce a line of exercise clothing with her brand on it. So I went to see him, and we arranged to have a lunch date. I went to his showroom, which was on 37th Street and 7th Avenue, and I walked into the showroom, and it was empty. So I called out his name, and no one came. No one responded. I called out his name again, and a guy came running out from the back. He was wearing a shoulder holster with a .32 caliber pistol in the holster, and he said to me, "Who the F are you?" And I said, "I'm so-and-so's cousin. I'm here to have lunch with him." So he went back inside, and a couple of minutes later, my cousin came out, and I said, "Who was that?" And he said, "I don't want to talk about it now, but I'll tell you over lunch." And over lunch, he told me that in order to have his dresses sent to his boutiques in places like Saks Fifth Avenue, Bonwood Teller, Bergdorf Goodman, he had to take on a guy in the mafia as his partner. Otherwise, the trucks wouldn't deliver his garments. And in the late 1980s, he sold his company to a very large foreign company. And that company's forensic accountant went through the books of my cousin's company, and they discovered that his mafia partner had a girlfriend in Paris and that his company had bought her a condominium there, which my cousin didn't know about. They leased her a Mercedes-Benz. They were paying the upkeep on the condominium, and they were giving her a monthly allowance. So
Okay, so a lot of examples in your personal life. Let's get into your books.
Okay.
Okay. You've written about sports. You've written about boxing. You've written about Hollywood. And now you have a general book out that's talking about hits, misses, wars, and prosecutions. Tell us about that.
May I hold it up for a second?
Sure.
That's the cover of the book, Mafia Hits, Misses, Wars, and Prosecutions. The thesis of the book is that no matter how much the government battles against the mafia, always manages to land on its feet. They may have to make some detours. They may have to change the way that they operate. They may have to have new bosses. But regardless of what happens, they still manage to survive and thrive. And throughout the book, I give a number of examples. And I thought perhaps the most pivotal event that affected the way the mafia did business was when Robert Kennedy became the Attorney General of the United States in the 1950s. He made a list of 800 mafioso, and he indicted 400 of them, and he got a 90% conviction rate. This was driving organized crime crazy. He was really interfering with the way they did business. So there was House of Representatives Committee on Assassinations, which were investigated the killing of John Kennedy. And this took place in 1975-76. And one of the people who was instrumental in that committee was a man named Robert Blakey, who had worked for Robert Kennedy in the Justice Department when Kennedy was Attorney General. And he was the chief counsel to this committee. And he's currently a law professor at Notre Dame University. And through the committee investigation, they found out that organized crime as a unit did not arrange for the assassination of the president, but two members of organized crime, a man named Carlos Marcello, who controlled the mafia in New Orleans, and a man named Santo Trafficante, who controlled the mafia in Tampa, Florida, conspired with Jimmy Hoffa, who had been a prime target of Robert Kennedy, to have John F. Kennedy assassinated. And the FBI and the committee had recordings of these two men conspiring. So at one point, one of them says to the other, "You don't stop a dog from biting by chopping off its tail. You stop a dog from biting by cutting off its head." And they also said that they needed to find a fall guy who would take the blame for the hit on the president. And the man who controlled all the bookmaking in New Orleans for Carlos Marcello, his nephew was Lee Harvey Oswald. And he said to Marcello, "I have the perfect fall guy for you. I have this nutty nephew who would be the perfect person to set up for this." And then they had all sorts of quotes. May I read you a couple of the quotes from the committee? They said, "Don't worry about that little son of a bitch." This is what I just said a little while ago. "The dog will stop biting, not by cutting off its tail, but by cutting off its head. We'll set up some nut to take the blame." That's an actual quote that the FBI had from this. And then in 1985, while Carlos Marcello was in prison, he said on a telephone call, "Yeah, I had this son of a bitch killed, and I'm glad I did it." And they had then in 1987, Frank Regano, who was the lawyer for both Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, and I had interviewed him many years ago, quoted Santo Trafficante saying, "I think Carlos screwed up getting rid of Giovanni, namely John. Maybe it should have been Bobby all along." So there was all of this information about how these men conspired to kill John Kennedy. And it changed the way the mafia did business. All of a sudden,
Now, who do you think killed then Lee Harvey Oswald?
Jack Ruby killed him. But both Jack Ruby,
Him because it was his fault, or
the way the mafia always operated was that they would assign some nut to commit a murder, and then they would have the nut murdered so that he couldn't talk about who hired him. This was apparent in the murder of a gangster named Joe Colombo. He was murdered probably on the orders of Joey Gallo, but Joey Gallo got a black gangster named Jerome Johnson to actually fire the bullets that incapacitated Joseph Colombo. And then immediately afterwards, Johnson was shot right at the site and killed. There was no opportunity for him to say who hired him or who put him up to this. And one of the things that Lee Harvey Oswald said before he was killed was he said, "You don't understand. I'm just a patsy." He even understood what had happened. But this was probably the most pivotal event in the history of the mafia. And one can go online and read the full report from the Assassination Committee, and it makes for fascinating reading.
now you talk about in your new book, Mrs. Wars and Prosecutions.
So,
What?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
What?
First that I spoke about it was called the Castellammarese War. It was a war that got rid of the two dominant mafia figures in 1930-31. There were only two mafia bosses at that time, a man named Maranzano and a man named Joe Boss Mazzaria. And they were both kind of what you would call old world type guys. They both came from Sicily, and they didn't like with anybody who didn't come from Sicily. So there were young up and coming gangsters who were making names for themselves at the time. Frank Costello, whose real name was Francesco Castiglia, he took on an Irish name because he was in the bootleg business with Joseph Kennedy, and he thought having an Irish name would be easier for him to deal with these people than having an Italian name. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis. Joe Adonis, by the way, chose the name Adonis because he thought he was so handsome. But anyway, these four men were doing a lot of business, and Masseria didn't want to have anything to do with Frank Costello, because Frank Costello was from Naples, and he certainly didn't want to have anything to do with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel because they were Jewish. So Lucky Luciano and the rest of them decided that Masseria had to go, that he was interfering with our way of doing business. So they set him up. Lucky Luciano invited Masseria to have lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island and excused himself after lunch to go to the bathroom. And while he was in the bathroom, four men rushed in and murdered Joe Masseria. So they thought that Salvatore Maranzano, as the existing mafia boss, would be happy to go along with them now that he no longer had competition. But he was even worse, it turned out, than Joe Masseria. He didn't want anything to do with
Can I ask you to get all this information?
Through interviews, old newspaper articles, and also going through a lot of old FBI files.
Who would get interviewed for this kind of stuff?
There were a number of criminal defense attorneys, some of whom were in their 90s now, who dealt with these people when they were young men. And then also some very old retired gangsters who didn't want me to use their names, but were very happy to talk to me. They liked revisiting these things. It was fun for them. And then I could go to the FBI files. You could access most of them online. They were fascinating. For example, there's a 400-page file on Frank Sinatra, and his involvement with the mafia was extensive. And J. Edgar Hoover even referred to Frank Sinatra as a killer, which is another story. But so anyway, Maranzano turned out to be worse than Masseria, so they decided he would be killed. But because he didn't like dealing with Jews, Lucky Luciano decided that all the people who should kill Maranzano should be Jewish gangsters. And they were led by a gangster named Red Levine, who happened to be an Orthodox Jew. And someone asked him if he wore a yarmulke while he was committing these murders. And he said, no, I took it off and I put it in my pocket. But as soon as we finished killing Maranzano, I put it back on my head and we left. So some of these stories are amusing, and if they didn't involve so much murder and mayhem. So anyway, that was the beginning of the five mafia families, because then Luciano decided that he would divide these families into five groups. He headed one, and he assigned the heads to the others, and they partnered with other ethnicities, and everyone did business together. And then he and Meyer Lansky.
All right, families concentrated in New York or across the country?
In New York. They were the five mafia families of New York. But what they did is they then formed something called the National Crime Syndicate, which was headed by Luciano and Lansky. And that covered all organized crime from coast to coast. And they had their own commission, and the bosses of the five mafia families in New York sat on the commission, but so did about 10 other people who weren't in the Italian mafia. They were in other organizations throughout the country, such as the outfit in Chicago, which was multi-ethnic. And at the time, that was being run by Al Capone. But his second in charge was a Jewish gangster named Jacob Greasy Thumb Guzik. And whatever gangsters wanted to do, they had to have the consent of the commission in order to do it. If they didn't have the consent, they couldn't do it. So, for example, when Thomas Dewey was prosecuting the mafia in New York City in the 1930s, one of the gangsters, Dutch Schultz, wanted to assassinate Thomas Dewey. And the commission voted against it, saying that if you did it, it would bring too much heat on us.
Mm.
So Dutch Schultz said, well, the hell with you, I'm going to do it anyway. And he walked out of the commission meeting. As soon as he walked out of the commission meeting, the other commission members decided that they had to kill Dutch Schultz to prevent him from killing Thomas Dewey, which is what happened. He was killed in a steakhouse in Newark, New Jersey in 1935. The irony was that if they had killed Thomas Dewey, two of the commission members never would have been prosecuted, because Lucky Luciano was prosecuted by Thomas Dewey for running houses of prostitution in New York, and he got an incredible jail sentence of 50 years in prison. No one had ever gotten a jail sentence like that for being a pimp and a prostitute. And the other one was a man named Louis Lepke Buchholter, who ran all the unions and the trucking in the garment center. And he and a man named Albert Anastasia were head of something called Murder, Inc., which was organized crimes device for arranging for the murder of people that they wanted to kill across the country. And he was found guilty by Thomas Dewey, and he was the only organized crime boss who was sentenced to death, and he died in the electric chair in I think it was 1944. So if the commission had allowed Schultz to kill Thomas Dewey, neither Lucky Luciano nor Louis Lepke Buchholter ever would have been prosecuted, which was the irony, that they had saved Dewey's life in effect, and Dewey wound up prosecuting them to the highest possible degree that he could.
Huh. Now, you talk about a lot of what's happened in the 30s and into the 40s. How have you observed in what you've written about and interviews you've done, the mob evolving over the years? What's changed? What's stayed the same?
Targets of opportunity changed. So, for example, they controlled pornography for a very long time, and they controlled all the pornography that pretty much existed in Times Square. All of that is gone now, probably thanks to the internet, where pornography is free to anyone who has a wireless connection. In terms of drugs, they really let the South American and Central American cartels take control of that. The penalties were enacted because of drug dealing by Nelson Rockefeller when he was governor was so severe that it was easier to stay out of the drug business. And the other thing that changed the way the mafia did business is this fellow that I mentioned earlier, Robert Blakey. In 1972, he got Congress to enact a law called the RICO statute, which stands for racketeer, something, cooperation, whatever. And anyway, it's a law that permits prosecutors to prosecute bosses of mafia families for everything that their family does, even though they're not individually connected with it. And the penalties are severe. So when Rudy Giuliani had the commission trial and he convicted 4 of the bosses of the 5 mafia families, he sent them each to prison for 100 years. So nobody wanted to be a boss and be exposed to that kind of penalty. I spoke to a couple of criminal defense attorneys who said that they get calls from people who are ostensible mafia bosses today about how to avoid being indicted under a RICO statute so that they don't have to face those severe jail sentences. And so they've gone into things that are less high profile than some of the things they had done before. They're still very involved in construction and unions and real estate and illegal gambling and laundering money and stock fraud. Those are pretty much the things that they're involved in, but they don't get a lot of attention. And none of them want to be in the spotlight. None of them want to go the way of John Gotti, who was always in the spotlight, and look what happened to him.
That's a very interesting observation, because I did note in your title, you wrote decline, not demise.
They've declined, but they're never going anyplace. I think they're going to be with us forever.
What, of all the people you've interviewed, of all the stories you have, let's get a highlight from you.
One of the most interesting people I've ever written about was a man named Greg Scarpa, who was known as the Grim Reaper. And I spent a lot of time interviewing his criminal defense attorney, a man named Jay Goldberg, who was a brilliant criminal defense attorney who started out actually as a prosecutor working for Robert Kennedy in the Justice Department when Kennedy was Attorney General. And Greg Scarpa was one of his clients. Greg Scarpa was also known as the Grim Reaper because they estimated that he had killed between 80 and 100 people. And you know the story of Mississippi Burning with Gene Hackman? That's entirely a fiction. The Hackman character should have been played by Gregory Scarpa because Gregory Scarpa, for its entire life as a member of the mafia, had been an FBI informant. And the FBI gave him permission to commit pretty much whatever crime he wanted to, except for murder, which he didn't pay any attention to. But in I guess it was 63 or 64, when these three civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered, the FBI couldn't solve the case, and they couldn't violate their own laws about how to find the murderer and how to find the bodies. So they gave Gregory Scarpa $100,000 and 2 guns and sent him to Mississippi to find out. Now, the most suspicious character was a guy who operated an appliance store in Mississippi, and Gregory Scarpa went into the store and bought a television from him, and he asked this man to help him carry the television out to his car. And as the man was putting the television into the back seat of Scarpa's car, Scarpa pulled out a gun and pushed the guy into the passenger seat of the car and drove him to an abandoned military base in Mississippi. And he got the guy inside and he started beating him up. And he wanted to know where these 3 bodies were and who was responsible for killing them. And the guy wouldn't tell him. So Gregory Scarpa pulled down the man's pants, pulled down his underwear, pulled out a razor, and said he would cut off his vitals unless he told him. And the man immediately started crying and told him everything he wanted. And Gregory Scarpa was able to report this back to the FBI, and the FBI then did what they had to do to finish the case. And then they also hired him to find out the murder of the head of an NAACP, a person also in Mississippi, and he solved that case for them as well.
How do people go from the inside to the informing side, working with the FBI, yet stay on the inside to be able to inform? What if
Well, the people on the inside never knew he was an informer. Just like the people in Boston never knew that Whitey Bulger was an FBI informer. And the man who was...
Yeah, I get those informers.
They make deals with them. In other words, we know you're committing this crime and this crime, and we won't prosecute you for those crimes or any other, let's say, burglaries or extortion rackets that you're involved in, as long as you report to us worthwhile information that we can use to prosecute other members of organized crime.
So you can continue doing exactly what you're doing. We're going to turn a blind eye, but you just have to give us info.
Yeah, and the one thing that they said that Scarpa couldn't do is he couldn't commit any more murders. But if he committed them, he just didn't tell them about it. Now, at one point, he was indicted and he was tried. Now, this is also very interesting what happened to him. During the AIDS epidemic, he was terrified of being contaminated with blood. And he used to eat aspirin the way other people eat peanuts. And the aspirin had eaten away his stomach, and he had to go in for surgery. And he didn't want getting a blood transfusion from a stranger because he was frightened of getting AIDS. So he had one of his crew members give blood to be used during the transfusion. The crew member was a weightlifter who was injecting himself with steroids for months and years prior to this, and he was HIV positive. Scarpa didn't know this. So Scarpa came down with AIDS eventually. And this was after he was indicted and found guilty, and he was sentenced to house arrest for a while, and he had to wear an anklet so they could track where he was going. Now, one of his sons had been dealing drugs and was robbed by 2 drug dealers in Brooklyn. And Gregory Scarpa said, let's go out and find these 2 guys. And his son drove him to the neighborhood where these 2 guys were. And Scarpa saw them sitting on the porch of a house. And he pulled out a gun and started shooting at them from the car, and they returned fire, and they shot out one of Gregory Scarpa's eyes. So his son quickly drove him home. Gregory Scarpa runs into the house, and he took out a bottle of scotch and poured it into the socket of his bloody eye. Just then the FBI called and said, your alarm went off. You went out of the house. And he said, oh, yeah, I just ran to the drugstore to get a prescription filled, but I'm home now and everything is fine. And then his wife drove him to the hospital to have his eye patched up.
Oh
So
my gosh.
he was quite a character. So Jay Goldberg told me that he and his wife used to have lunch frequently in the city with Gregory Scarpa and his wife or mistress. He was a bigamist. And he said he was extremely knowledgeable. He could talk about finance. He could talk about history. He could talk about international relations between countries. He had encyclopedic knowledge that covered a broad area and was very deep as well. And he said he was always extremely well dressed, and he wore a beautiful toupee to cover up his bald spot. But as soon as he went back to Brooklyn and he had to commit a murder, he would take the toupee off and take off his fine clothing and dress more as a common gangster and go out and kill somebody. But his FBI handler, who had permitted so many of these crimes to take place, was also indicted afterwards because the leash that he put on Gregory Scarpa was extremely long. And basically he let Scarpa do pretty much everything he wanted to do.
You almost wonder about that fine line between the law and the criminal.
There is a fine line between them. One of my books, I wrote about two mafia cops who were on the payroll of the Colombo and I think also the Lucchese family. And they were receiving $3,000 a month plus payments for each person that they killed for the mafia. And they murdered 7 people while being New York City detectives. And were both arrested and sentenced to life in prison, and they've since died. But it was amazing how many murders they got away with and how many murders they committed as policemen. And it was one guy that they stopped at the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn who was a member of the mafia. And he thought, oh, I know these guys, they just want to pay off from me. And so he pulled off to the side of the road and he was going to give them some money. And instead they shot and killed him because that's what they were assigned to do. It was extraordinary.
Do you get any phone calls about your books when they come out today?
No threatening phone calls, thank God.
You cover a lot of history in them, which I guess is good for anybody who's in business and whatever you're doing. It's always good to know history.
I love history, and I've really studied the history of organized crime, beginning with a man named Arnold Rothstein, who fixed the 1919 World Series and became the founder, in effect, of organized crime, and was the mentor to those 4 people I mentioned earlier, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel. He taught them how to organize crime.
I think something like organized crime took hold.
Took hold because of Prohibition. Prior to Prohibition, there were all kinds of gangs. There were a lot of different gangs in New York. And the gangs in New York tended to work for the politicians, especially Tammany Hall. They controlled the elections. The gangs made sure who voted, how many times they voted, how to disguise voters so they could vote multiple times. By the time Prohibition came into being, the gangsters were making so much money that the politicians began working for the gangsters rather than the other way around. All the politicians, major politicians in New York, were on the payroll of the gangsters, judges, prosecutors, police. Everyone was getting rich from Prohibition. It's extraordinary.
What kind of things would, in modern society, do you think would create a rebirth like that? What kind of rules? Do you think that's happening with cannabis, for example, right now? Or
Certainly happened with
drugs prior, I should say?
it was certainly happening with drugs prior to the legalization of cannabis. Heroin and cocaine, there was a lot of money being made. One of my clients, when I had my marketing business, said, if I wanted to invest $50,000 in a drug scheme, he could make sure that I got $500,000 back. And I said, no, I don't want to take the chance. It's not something I'm interested in doing. $500,000 is a lot of money, but I don't feel like going to jail for 30 or 40 years. So it's not worth it to me.
It's very fascinating. What's on the plate next? Because these books, there's got to be a new one coming.
I'm working on a book about the garment center, how organized crime controlled fashion and the garment center in the United States from 1920 to 1990. They had an iron grip on every dress, every suit that was made in the United States until that stuff started being made overseas. And the price of garments was affected anywhere from 10 to 40% because of the mafia control over it.
Those are big numbers.
They
Do
were
you
very
think
big numbers.
do you think that was instrumental to giving China the entree into so much manufacturing?
It was. When I had my marketing PR business, it was an accessory company that made handbags. And they had been making handbags in the United States. And it cost them about $75 to make a single leather, or a very good quality leather handbag. When they moved their operation to China, they had the same handbag made for $15
Mhm.
in China, but they charged the same retail price in America. So their margins were just extraordinary after that.
So that was because of charges they were getting for distribution and everything here from
The
the
part of it was, yeah, because they had to truck their handbags to department stores all around the country.
so the cost was largely in the trucking and getting
The,
moving
the,
product.
it was that, and then unionized workers. Um, the unions were largely controlled by organized crime. And if you wanted labor peace, if you didn't want your workers to go on strike, you had to pay the union an extortionate fee to keep your workers working. And that added to the cost of manufacturing.
Oh my gosh, Jeff, I always feel like I could listen to you for ages.
Thank
We're
you.
out of time. It bums me out, but we have had another great conversation. If you've been listening to this, you're definitely going to want to share it with your friends. I've been speaking with Jeff Sussman, who is clearly a really strong historian about the mafia in the United States. And he's written a lot of books. He's got a new book out now. Jeff, you want to show everybody that book again before we go off? And you
Sure.
want to pick this up? There will be links to it. It is Mafia Hits, Mrs. Wars and Prosecutions, the Rise and Decline of the Mob in America. You're absolutely going to want to pick up a copy of that. There'll be links below. There'll be links to other ways you can stay in touch with Jeff. Jeff, we're moving over to the green room. I want to thank you all for watching. This is the Silver Expedience Perception Dynamics podcast. I'm Dian Griesel, the host. Hit subscribe, share this with your friends, and enjoy your workout or your drive or wherever you watch or listen to these podcasts. Thanks a lot. See you next time.
That was wonderful.